Under the church door at Tukley, someone had pushed a small white envelope overnight. On the envelope were written just 6 words: "It was meant to be forever." And inside, with nothing else written, was a wedding ring. I can only imagine the heartache of that person, woman or man, I don't know, who had come back possibly to the church they'd been married in, where they'd made vows, wedding vows, which they intended to be forever. And yet somehow, some number of years later, when that marriage fell apart, they brought the ring back to the church, perhaps as an act of defiance, as an act of protest, but more likely just with a sense of desperate heartache to somehow make sense of the promises they'd made and had made to them, which had now fallen apart, perhaps in an act of betrayal and great heartache. Now, I know some of you watching this have also been through the heartache of divorce and a failed marriage. Many others amongst us have seen people we love go through it. And if you have, then you have some idea of the tragedy of the breaking of the promise of the covenant between God and the people of Israel that we hear broken today in the first reading, which is taken from the second book of Chronicles. Today I want to take a bit of a detour from the Gospels we usually look at, to look at the Old Testament reading, and not just today's Old Testament reading, but the readings we hear throughout the season of Lent, because they tell a very particular story. Now, normally if you follow during the ordinary time, the Old Testament reading shows reflects and connects to the Gospel. It might give some background or some parallel or some allusion, but during the season of Lent, it doesn't. The Old Testament readings taken together tell their own story. So I want to take you through that story. We might see what it says to us today. So for the first 3 weeks of Lent, we heard readings which related to covenants which God had made with his people. In the first week, we heard of Noah and the promise God made that God would never again destroy the earth. In the second week of Lent, we heard of Abraham and his great faith, his willingness even to sacrifice his son, which led to God later then making a covenant with him that he would be the father of a great nation. Last week, in the third Sunday of Lent, we hear of the human part of God's covenant with Moses, a covenant which God says, "I will be your people and you will be my God, and here are the commands which you must live by to show that you are keeping that covenant." And so we hear this beautiful sense of these many covenants which God had made with humanity. And Professor Scott Hahn talks about there being 4 covenants which God made, and the 4th one being one with David, which we don't hear in Lent, but we do hear it in other times. And so God makes these covenants, these successive promises of a deepening personal relationship with the people of Israel through Noah, then Abraham, then Moses, then David. And a covenant is best paralleled by a marriage. It's a covenant which both people must enter into freely. Both people receive something, and it's meant to be, and it is like the words written on that envelope years ago, it is meant to be forever. So well and good, God makes these covenants, and the people of Israel at first respond wholeheartedly. But what we hear in today's first reading, from the very end of the book of Chronicles, is the tragic end, the breaking of that covenant. Time and time again, people strayed away from God's promises, and yet God sent prophets to steer them back. And all the prophetic books we hear in the Old Testament are exactly that, prophets calling the people of Israel back to the covenant they've made with God and God has made with them. But today we hear that after the priests in the temple and the people, we hear at infidelity, they stray from God, they turn to other gods. And in the end, God simply says, "You have broken the covenant," and that's it. We hear that God then allows for tragedy to overtake Israel. I'm not sure whether God really had a hand in that, or whether simply in hindsight that's how they interpret it. But nonetheless, the history is real. The people of Israel were taken as slaves, as exiles to Babylon. They'd been in Egypt before, now they're in Babylon. The temple is destroyed and the land is left utterly desolate. It is a horrible end to what should have been a beautiful love story between God and God's people. And the writer of Chronicles tries to present it in a positive light, tries to finish the book with a little bit of an uptick, telling us that, well, a couple of generations later, the people of Israel did go back under King Cyrus. They went back to Israel. They went back to their land. And they did rebuild the temple. And it seemed like, oh, that's all good. But it wasn't really, because they would go back to Israel, but they would be occupied again by the Greeks and then the Romans that takes up to the time of Jesus. They build a new temple, but that temple too would be destroyed by the Romans. So the promises of those earlier covenants of being a free people in their land, of having a temple to worship in, of having a king on the throne, all of those covenants ultimately failed. Not because God failed, but because humanity did. And so we're left in the season of Lent with this awful, tragic ending. But next week, there is hope. Next week we hear through Jeremiah, we hear the promise that God says, I will make a new covenant with the people, not written on stones, but written in people's hearts. The promise of something new and wonderful still to come. That is the hope we turn to. But for the people of Israel, they'd have to wait many hundreds of years to see if that new covenant would ever come, because they spent hundreds of years, as I said, occupied by the Greeks and the Romans. Life was not easy, really, ever for the people or the nation of Israel. Would there be a new covenant? The people of Israel had to wait hundreds of years. We will have to wait only until the celebration of the Last Supper on Holy Thursday night to find out what God had in store.